For this recording of the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics podcast, we were joined by former president of Southern New Hampshire University, Paul LeBlanc. During this workshop, Dr. LeBlanc discusses his insights into how universities can respond to the proliferation of emerging technologies, especially those that impact the development and teaching of writing skills. Here, LeBlanc argues that universities ought to focus on a competency approach over granular skill development, and just exactly what this means for curriculums going forward. As always, this podcast is brought to you by the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics at the University of Kansas. You can find us online at i2s.ku.edu and on Spotify. Thank you for listening and enjoy. This workshop is part of the workshop series that we're running out of the Center for Cybersocial Dynamics here at the University of Kansas. This is our first semester really in operation as a center. We were launched in November. So we got started. Now we're up and running. The center has 6 main research topics at this point. You can learn more about the center if you go to our website. And we aim to be a kind of interdisciplinary hub for the study of the interplay between society and technology here at the University of Kansas. So we're a cross-college unit. We bridge the engineers, the social scientists, the humanists, and so on. And that's what we're hoping to do. So I'll introduce Paul. So again, Paul, thank you for joining us. Paul LeBlanc is president of the Southern New Hampshire University. And this is one of the largest universities in America, actually, SNHU. He's been leading the university since 2016. And during his tenure as president, the university has grown in terms of enrollment more than 4 times, which is quite extraordinary. I first learned of Paul when I read an editorial he wrote about AI and raised very clear and important questions about both the future of higher ed, the future of work, the role of education, in ways that I found actually really refreshing. And I wanted to learn more. So I reached out to Paul, and he was gracious enough to agree to join us for this conversation. And so just to say a little bit about SNHU, and then we can jump right into the discussion. SNHU is an interesting operation, and it's certainly the largest provider of online education, maybe in the Northeast. Western Governors is also a very big operation, but maybe SNHU is as big as Western Governors. I'm not sure. The other striking thing about Paul's leadership is he's created a university where competence is central as opposed to coursework. So I'm not sure, maybe you can say a little bit more about
absolutely.
It. But the idea is to have a competence-based degree. So that when you graduate from SNHU, you've demonstrated a level of competence that is the target of the education there, rather than just having finished a certain number of credit hours and so on. So maybe with that, Paul, before we jump into AI and the future of the university, you could say a little bit about features of SNHU and it's the operation you have there.
Let me just give you in sort of broad strokes a little bit of a thumbnail. That would just sort of ground the conversation. So as you said, I've been here 20 years this July. So it goes by very fast. Like when I came, it was 2,500 students. So it was very, very small, almost entirely residential, very tiny online operation. 185,000 students. So massive growth in that time. In 2012, we were the 50th largest nonprofit provider of online degrees. Babson University does an annual listing. And just 3 years later, we were number 4. And then 2 years later, we were number 1 or 2, depending on how you count.
Okay.
We and Western Governors are about exactly the same size. We give more undergraduate degrees. They give more graduate degrees. So we're roughly the same size. We'd be the 2 largest in the U.S., not in North America. UNAM in Mexico City, for example, I think it's close to 400,000. There are some other schools. But in the U.S., certainly the 2 largest now. There was a time when there was a larger one, of course, which was Phoenix, which really kind of sullied the reputation of online. But they had about 500,000 when they were at their height. They're down to about 85,000. And the for-profit providers are kind of in a nosedive, right? They're either being closed down by the Department of Ed, et cetera. As you said, so we have a bucolic, beautiful little campus in Manchester, New Hampshire. It's about 4,000 students, 181,000 online. I want to say something about who we serve because it's very particular. We really think about the 45% of Americans who say they would struggle to come up with $400 for an unexpected car repair. Our learners are, a 30-year-old, 2 tours in Vietnam, Afghanistan, even Vietnam. We just had some Vietnam grads graduate this weekend. But more typically, Iraq, Afghanistan, they maybe have a couple of kids. 86% of them are working. They're stuck in a dead-end job. They need to get a post-secondary credential to unlock economic opportunity for themselves. It's very clear. On a residential campus, on an undergraduate campus like University of Kansas, you offer, sterling academic experience, but you also offer a coming of age experience that's very quintessentially American and quintessentially residential. This is where you go to find out what you're all about, late night conversations in the dorms, playing on teams, drinking too much beer on Saturday, falling in love, meeting your future spouse, travel abroad. All of that collectively, I would put in a bucket called coming of age. And it's a very American higher ed, traditional age world. My students, they've had all the coming of age they can handle. They get kids, job, economic challenges, et cetera. So we get very, very focused on cost, making it within reach, linking it to jobs and job opportunities. So if you take a look at our students, it used to be 80% of them came to us with credits from before. They had tried college, life got in the way, they weren't ready, whatever happened, it was 10 years ago, now they're coming back to complete. That percentage continues to go down as we do more and more work with very large employers. So we're the largest academic partner for Walmart. We're the largest academic partner for Amazon, and they're training frontline workers. They're upskilling. Interestingly, they don't say much about this. We are not allowed to say much about this. I'll share it in in our conversation. But these are companies that see the coming automation, and partly what they're trying to do is get their employees to a place where they won't be displaced, because those frontline jobs and warehouses are increasingly automated. For just one example. The result of doing more and more with frontline workers and large employers is that the percentage of our students who have credits is down to 60%. Those are the most challenging students. That's the highest risk of attrition because they have had no college under their belt. They tend to overestimate the amount of time they have, underestimate the time that is required. And it's been a long time since they've written a paper, or their high school math is long past them. So it's a big challenge. We have 30,000 students of color, more than the largest HBCU. We have more Native American students than the largest tribal college. And interestingly, we see a new demographic coming out of the pandemic, which is about 30,000 traditional age students. So we have 30,000 17 and 22-year-olds. Those were not typically online learners in the past, but something's happened. And I think that something is a combination. We're still trying to unpack it. A combination of the pandemic. They had online learning, whether they wanted it or not. And a lot of them discovered this kind of works for me. A lot of those 30,000 traditional age students have the same problem as our adults. They've got family responsibilities. They're working. All of a sudden, I realized the convenience of online works much better for them. If you're familiar with the work of Clay Christensen, famous Harvard School business professor who coined this phrase of disruptive innovation and did all this research on disruptive innovation, Clay was a dear friend of mine, 40 years. He passed away a couple of years ago and was on my board and was a trustee emeritus. We very much use his playbook for how we think about innovation. So we, in 2014, created College for America, which was a competency-based ed program, as John mentioned to you. So the bulk of what we do is still traditional and credit-based. But we have thousands and thousands of students in our CBE programs, and they are very different in that they're untethered to the credit hour. In a book I did in 2021 called Students First, I argued that the credit hour is not only a faulty foundation for trying to understand learning, because if you think about it, fixed variable item is time, a 15-week semester, the 3-credit-hour course, and the variable is student academic performance, A, B, C, D, or F. And a competency-based model, you flip it. So what we were able to do is make time a variable, and learning was fixed. So you don't progress without demonstrating mastery, and mastery is defined by a very well-articulated rubric. And you don't have grades, you have mastery and not yet. This is very powerful. For one, it actually brings genuine rigor and integrity to the learning process. because I talk to CEOs all the time. And I can ask them, raise your hand if you've hired somebody from a really reputable 4-year institution who doesn't write very well. You know how many hands go up in the room? Every hand goes up in the room. I can do this with quant. I can do this with almost anything you think about that we typically associate with a college-educated person. So employers really love competency-based education. They speak in terms of competencies and skills. They think about what can my people do or what can't they do. I want to come back to this because I think in an age of AI, this is going to be critically important. If you're familiar with the Gartner curve argues that new innovations come up, we get this irrational exuberance, and then they disappoint and they go down into the slough of despair where we say, oh, that was just another fad. And then they kind of make their way back slowly and organically and in a more substantial way. So the easy example there is MOOCs. When MOOCs were created, George Siemens, whose name will come up later again, created the first MOOC in Canada, and then they became very popular. It was like, oh, it's going to change the world. edX, Coursera are going to change the whole world. Higher ed will be disrupted. And of course, they didn't, and their graduation rates were poor. And the only people who did graduate from their courses were people who already had college degrees. And while they could still find a Mongolian sheep herder to talk about, mastering physics and now going to Princeton, they were the edge case. They were the exception. But it was a great story. So then everyone wrote them off. Oh, MOOCs were a disaster, yet another higher ed fad. But in reality, MOOCs kind of then found their way. And edX was just sold for $850 million. Coursera's, educating lots and lots of people. And they didn't change all of higher ed, but they became part of the ecosystem. I think the same is happening with CBE today. So now that's that's our story. And now ChatGPT happens.
Great. So this brings us to, the way that AI is going to change this landscape again. So maybe you could say a little bit about how you think AI is going to force us to reevaluate what we're doing in the classroom, the character of sort of institutional design in higher ed. There's a whole range of questions. I know you've given a lot of thought to that. But before we go to so maybe we'll just let you take it from there. So
I can think about this and sort of if I can sort of use the overviews at what altitude do we want to take up the question? At the sort of 10,000 foot level, you're getting lots of campus discussions about academic integrity and cheating and what do we think? How do we think about writing in the future? And I'd love to talk about that. My dissertation research long ago was on literacy behaviors and technology. So this has been something I've thought about forever. And I think it's just fascinating to think about this question of writing in AI. What is its role? People now thinking about, wait a minute, what are the tools that my students now have to master in their repertoire as a fill-in-the-blank major? So if you're in the creative fields, what are the new tools? Like, if you work in the world of film, there's certain tools you're expected to know. So let me give you a simple example. I was talking to someone who has a 2-year program, and one of their programs is for paralegals. And they've now quickly integrated the use of ChatGPT as one of the tools that a paralegal needs to master and really think about how to use it. It's not just like, here's how to use it, but how does it change the work? And what they're basically saying to their graduates is you have to enter the market now as a 10x paralegal. So what is a 10x paralegal? It's a paralegal who can do the work of 10 paralegals. And that sort of raises another question we should get into, which is, well, what happens to the other 9? Like I am in the camp that thinks we're going to see massive job displacement, like super threatening to society levels of job displacement. So that's the second level. So what tools do you have? So if I'm sort of producing mathematicians, what tools? If I'm producing accountants, what tools? PwC announced last week that they're putting billions of dollars into the use of AI. And while they talk about giving their accountants more powerful tools and training them to use these more powerful tools, I would bet hard money that we have 15% of the accountants in the future that we have today. I think PwC is going to automate all those low-level and mid-level knowledge jobs, and maybe even some high-level knowledge jobs. And by the way, this is happening in technology, right? Just field after field. So what are the tools that our students need to master? Next level, workforce. What jobs are going away? Should you be training accountants? In good conscience, would you counsel a friend's son or daughter to become a software programmer? Like at this point, example, I was talking to someone who heads up a cybersecurity team at Oracle. His team just used ChatGPT to write what would have taken, as he described it, hundreds of hours of contract programmers. ChatGPT did it in lightning speed. I said, first point, a whole lot of people didn't get work from Oracle on that project. Second point, I said, was it good? And he said, 90% of it was really good. My team looked at about 10% that they wanted to change. And I said, so what happened then? He said, well, they started changing it. And then they paused and said, why are we doing this? Let's prompt ChatGPT to fix its problems, which they did, which actually raises questions about their job. So on another level, you start thinking about workforce, what majors, how do we change majors? And, there's a way of thinking about this. I just did an essay with a colleague in Paris that is getting published, I think, next week. But we went back to look at the Industrial Revolution and said, really, if you go back and look historically, you can put jobs into sort of four categories when a paradigm shifting technology happens. Jobs that absolutely don't get touched. Jobs that completely go away. Those are the easy ones. Jobs that persist, but are substantially augmented and changed because of the new technology. And then jobs that get created that don't exist because of the technology. And of course, the interesting question in this one is that if the jobs that AI creates are other knowledge work jobs, then there's a good chance that AI can do those jobs instead of humans. So if now I'm going to go up to the highest level, and I'm going to borrow from George Siemens, who, as I mentioned earlier, great thinker here in this space. George argues now that if you think about invention of steam, all of a sudden physical labor was much less valuable. Like the ability to do physical labor as steam and power tools and technologies took hold, you didn't pay very much for physical labor anymore. Those are the lowest paid jobs, right? Because it wasn't scarce. There were lots of physical labor out there, and I'm going to use the tools instead. If you think about knowledge now is much less scarce, right? It's abundant. I get all here with a ChatGPT prompt, and we can talk about accuracies and hallucinations, et cetera. If that's true, knowledge just got a lot less valuable. And then we ask the question, sort of, what then becomes valuable instead? So what George has argued is that higher education generally, has always been built on epistemology, ways of knowing what is knowledge, what is it to know. And now we'll shift over to questions of ontology, of being. We need to really serious questions about what does it mean to be human in this world? What does it mean to be in community? What does it mean to be work? What does it mean to be in a relationship? That's a flip of the switch for higher education. Because what we do, go back to that coming of age bucket of things I described to you. What we do is we spend all our time on epistemology questions. We could spend weeks in a curriculum committee meeting debating a program. All of you who are academics and have sat through them know this. We really focus on that as our primary function, properly so. And we generally believe that those ontological questions will get addressed in that coming of age bucket. Yeah, you're going to live in the dorm. You're going to be in a community of people. You're going to figure yourself out. You're going to travel abroad. You're going to experience things. You're going to grow, evolve, and you're going to be a different human being than you came in 4 years earlier. George might argue that that's going to flip, that the knowledge-making piece becomes way less valuable and important in this sort of these ontological questions. So that's an interesting question, right, to work through. I mean, it would be a massive existential change for our universities.
Let me jump in.
Yeah, I'm giving you a lot, but those are the big
no worries. This is really good. This is really interesting. So maybe you could say a little bit then about, just very concretely, given that this change takes place, as you've predicted, and given that sort of knowledge work per se, or sort of, let's say, the kind of expertise, let's say, and specific details that we can now look up on Google, we've always been able to do that, or via ChatGPT comes to the fore. And how does the actual institutional structure of a university change? So how, for example, would a place like SNHU rethink its pursuit of meaningfulness, or these kinds of what you're calling ontological questions, given, for example, that you don't really have a philosophy department? I mean, if suddenly this is the revenge of the humanities, where we're kind of coming back and displacing a more vocational model of education, or a traditionally vocational model of education, how does an institution like yours respond?
We'll do what everyone will do, which is we'll start to deploy AI and point solutions, right? We'll start to find places where we can deploy it. We'll have those conversations about what do our majors need to know. those are easy. They're not easy, but those are accessible to people, and we'll do all of those things. Our people are using it already across the university. Our instruction design people are using it. I can give you some quick examples. Use ChatGPT to do a structural unit and phlebotomy for our nursing program. It did it in about 30 seconds. They looked at it. They tweaked a couple of things using ChatGPT, just like different prompts, explain this concept. They brought it to the nursing faculty. They said, hey, take a look at this. And they said, yeah, it's pretty good. Well, where'd you get it? I said, we just did it on AI. It took under a minute. So a sobering notion, right? We're using it in marketing. Our folks on the creative team said, write a 60-second commercial for SNHU with the two following value propositions. Said the same conversation with our CMO. Was it good? She said, it was really good, like 90%. We tweaked it. And then when they tweaked it, they said to ChatGPT, we're going to shoot this commercial. Give us the shot selection, no more than 10 shots. I said, how's that? 8 of them were the ones we would have chosen. We tweaked a couple. HR is using it. Someone just did a 360. They sent an email out to 8 people on someone's team, said, here are the questions we're looking at. You know that John has been working on these things. He'd love your feedback on these. Can you just send this to me? Rather than going through and distilling that, they just put it all into one document, loaded into ChatGPT, said, distill this and give me the 3 main takeaways and give me 2 suggestions for this employee to improve their performance based on their. I looked, was it good? Yeah, it was really good. I tweaked it. So everyone's like this low and middle level knowledge work where you're really using your judgment and your personalization. Right? We and other universities will do that. I think at the very same time, we will not unlock the full potential of AI when we are doing point solutions. And this is an argument that comes out of a really very good book that I recommend to everybody. It came out about a month before ChatGPT became popular. It's called Power and Prediction by 3 economists at the University of Toronto. And what they argue is that you really only unlock full potential of something like AI when you do full system design. So we're launching a sort of dual effort at SNHU. Go back to your question. We're encouraging everyone to play with it, use it. It's the best way to learn is to play, figure out how to share our learning, and just do that updating on a regular basis. And that's going to change things. Some of it's going to be difficult. I have one department of 200 people who do transfer credit evaluations. Remember I said all these people come to us for credits? Theoretically, AI could displace 200 jobs. I don't want to have 200 people lose their jobs. So we're beginning a conversation with HR is how do we get ahead of that and start retraining them as advisors and other roles that are actually more relational and harder to automate. So we're going to work hard not to displace people, but that's just one of many examples. While we have all of that point solution work going on, we're having a special sort of skunk works, if you will, group to just do a clean sheet of paper redesign of the university if we were starting it tomorrow using AI and no assumptions about what we do and what we don't do.
If, for example, we become more invested in this kind of interpersonal relationship-based service model, is that going to cause you to redesign or rethink SNHU?
The notion, I did a book that came out last fall called Broken, subtitle being How Our Social Systems Are Failing Us and How We Can Fix It. I have been long looking at this question of automation and AI. I didn't know it was going to happen just 2 months later in this profound way that it did, but anticipates, and I've been in the camp for a while, that thinks we'll see massive job displacement. There's one study that came out of the University of Oxford pre-ChatGPT predicted something like 55 to 60% of American jobs get wiped out by automation. Much, much higher percentage, by the way, than happens with free trade agreements, for example. Understanding that, what I try to argue, we have massive sectors of our society are really relational in their systems of care. So healthcare, mental health treatment, K-12, higher ed, these are all systems of human transformation. And the book argues, and this really comes out of spending a lot of time with people like Jessica Benjamin, the psychologist at NYU, and Matt Steinfeld at Yale, and sociologists like Greg Elliott at Brown, to really transform a person's life. You have to do it in relationship. It only happens in relationship. If you know the work of Donna Beadle, who looks at extreme poverty, she would say, no one who has escaped extreme poverty has ever cited a program, a platform, a policy, a system, or a government program. You know what they cite? Cite a human being, someone who believes in them and helps, sponsors them, mentors them, lifts them up. I think most of us who think about our educational experience, when we talk about the truly transformational aspects of that, it's always people we identify. It was a teacher in grade school or high school, a mentor in college, colleague, a coach. It's always in relationship with someone. So if you think about that, we have tried to, through the use of technology and efficiency and late capitalist, post-Reagan, small government, we have tried to drive the human relationship out of our systems of care. We minimize how much time you get with your doctor or your caregiver, right? We overload classes. It's just all, I see some nods, so you all get this. So what I argue in the book is that as we lose knowledge work jobs, really what we need to do is flood. There's no lack of jobs that need to get done. To your point, John, right? We just don't like to pay for them. But we should flood our K-12 system with great teachers and social workers and counselors. Take a look at the state of mental health in America, that troubling CDC report of 6 weeks ago, which said that 25% of adolescent girls in the United States have planned their suicide in the last 12 months, and 13% have tried it. This is a frigging crisis. So we need to flood our system, our K-12 system. We need to flood our inner cities with social workers, rebuild a broken mental health system, which is essentially our prison system at this point. We don't have a functioning mental health system in the United States. Counselors, right? Psychologists, psychiatrists, caregivers. We need to rebuild a broken criminal justice system, I would argue, which, I went through and read mission statement of almost every correctional system in America. They all talk about redeeming people, bringing them back into society, educating them, getting them prepared for reentry. And a state like California spends about 1.5% of its prison budget on those efforts. It's a joke. And if you look at a single county like Cook County in Chicago, 70,000 young men, mostly men, go in and out of Cook County jail every year. It's just a rotating door, right? We don't have a lack of jobs that need to be done. We just don't like paying for them. We don't give them much status. And as knowledge work starts to be displaced, I think there is an invitation or an opportunity to radically rethink the nature of work in America. And I think we'll have to, because the civil unrest that will come when people don't have jobs. I'll give you just one example. It's not even a knowledge work job, but it's a job that AI will displace: truck driving. Truck driving is the number one middle-class job for undegreed white men in 34 states. So in 34 states, if you don't have a college degree or post-secondary degree, you're most likely at a road to a middle-class wage is to be a truck driver. Those jobs are gone. 10 years from now, they will be gone, are largely gone. And there'll be many, many other examples of that. So we need to rethink this. And of course, the question always comes, how would we pay for it? So Bill Gates would say, tax the robots. Like if you are a large corporation making a ton of money and you've automated, you'll be taxed for it.
The question of, how we value those kinds of jobs and how we incentivize people to move into that kind of work, that's one question. But let's think about education and return to sort of the core topic here. How do we rethink education to prepare people to be ready to be, to live meaningful lives that are deeply relational, that are, involve caring for others?
So there are a number of things. So one is we're going to take a look at majors. So you asked, how's SNHU thinking about this? We're looking at a major, like, do we need to really start to expand much more quickly in areas like education and healthcare, which are systems of care that aren't easily automated. They'll all be AI enhanced, but they won't be AI replaced. We start moving into more and more of those jobs. Think about phasing out areas like, we have a coding boot camp. Should we hold on to a coding boot camp? Probably not. How do we rethink it, or do we discontinue it? Like these are hard questions because real people's jobs, real people's lives, they will be answered for us. I'd rather answer them for ourselves. Those are some of the conversations that we're beginning to have. For those AI enhanced jobs, I'm going to go back to something we said earlier. I would argue in some ways that all curricula has been rendered instantly obsolete, or at least out of date. Every department needs to be looking at its curriculum and saying, how does it change? I was a writing teacher, so I'll talk about writing. So writing has always been itself a technology, which we forget. And with every change in communication literacy, certain cognitive skills went down, disappeared off the scale of the top 5 most important, others came up. If you think about what an oral pre-writing culture looked like, memorization was your number one cognitive skill. Where would you put memorization today? You wouldn't even put in the top 10 of cognitive skills we want our students to possess. Once the printing press came along, and there was lots of knowledge now promulgated, more than you could memorize, the ability to think in terms of taxonomies and classification became more important. I can't know everything in the library. I need to know where to find the things that I need to know when I have a question. And with each of these changes in the sort of cognitive priorities, our way we think, driven by changes in our literacy technologies. Writing was a technology, printing press was a technology. With each of those, there were critics who railed about, oh my God, the world is ending as we know it. That includes Socrates, right? Quintilian, who sort of rails against writing. It's going to make you stupid. There is no dialogic in writing. Once it's written and you say a stupid thing, it will be stupid for as long as it ever exists. But they had arguments about what this was going to do with the quality of our thinking. We're having one of those moments now. Epistemology giving way, at least entirely, to ontology. But I do think how we think about knowledge and knowledge making and knowledge management will evolve pretty dramatically. If you think about writing, I think it's going to be a question of, do I have the frameworks that allow me to put my algorithmic coworker to work? Am I giving them the right questions, the right prompts? So prompt engineering is the hot phrase these days, right? So am I doing... Do I have those frameworks? And then do I have the frameworks to judge the quality of what it produced for me? So if I used to go back to that Oracle example, those engineers had to know how to shape the work for that coding that they needed. And then remember my question then, was it any good? They needed to have the frameworks that allowed them to make that assessment. And then they could rewrite the prompts, right? But they weren't doing that work.
I think Bert, Ramon, Syed. I mean, Syed has his hand up. Bert doesn't. Ramon has. So let's start with Syed.
Hello. Thank you for the talk. It's been super interesting. Yeah. So I'm Syed. I am a fourth year PhD student. I work with John. My entire dissertation is on large language models, but my specific one with writing is guest editing a journal issue for teaching philosophy, and it's of course heavily focused on writing. Just a quick question. It's I think a clarification question. So are you suggesting, at least for your more of an online university, about how to assess people outside of writing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think writing will be an artifact. So I think this is where I said I would eventually circle back to competency-based education. Competency-based education essentially asks only two questions. When you start to unpack them, they're pretty complicated. But the two basic questions are, what can you do with what you know? So I think that's a really pertinent question in an AI world, because what you can know is a prompt away. What can you do with it? That really becomes more the critical question. And then the second question I ask is, how do we know? What's your assessment? The assessments in this case become performance-based, right? So we now start to think about other ways of assessing. I would argue that writing has long been a relatively poor assessment vehicle, except for understanding writing. Can you write well? But for lots of other things, I'm not so sure. So my hope is that the move into the influence of chat, our AI on education actually accelerates our movement towards competency-based education, which I'm a big believer in.
Yes. Hi, Paul. Thank you very much for this very sobering talk. I'm Ramon Alvarado. I'm an assistant professor of philosophy, and I teach data ethics, and most of my work is in philosophy of computation, epistemology, and ethics of AI and data science at the University of Oregon. Besides prompt engineer, of course, which is the new thing that people are jumping in, how do you prepare students for the possibility of being able to ask good questions going forth, right? Because it's not just about having knowledge. It's not just about managing propositions that are already there. It's about, knowledge, a lot of it, especially for us philosophers, but we for most of us humans that want to know, questions are the most important element of knowledge, right?
I was a literature major as an undergraduate. I became pretty good at asking the right questions of the novels I was reading. I never wrote a novel. I don't write fiction. Do I have to write code in order to do what you described earlier when your team looked at code and made a decision? I used to think so, but you know what? Our coders don't write code. They curate code. They're on GitHub. They're pulling code, right? So they have frameworks, they have architectural, they have architecture of understanding that allows them both to curate. They can farm out as they were doing because they were doing something new and kind of complicated, but they still needed a framework to understand and assess. Just as I understood and assess a novel, they had it for asking questions of the code they were looking at. Was it elegant? Did it do this? Did it integrate in this way? Knowledge making will be less about the production of knowledge and much more about the kinds of questions we ask of the world and our ability to assess the answers, and then what we do with that. I mean, I'm sure you've all followed the work around protein folding. What you have is the ability to ask a whole new set of questions that couldn't even be asked before AI. Like, That's where I think it gets very exciting. You call the comments sobering. They are in some ways, but holy cow, what's possible now is just amazing.
I'm Ryan LeMasters. I'm a first-year PhD student in the Department of Philosophy here at University of Kansas, and I do stuff on ethics and technology. Thanks for the talk. So I just wanted to ask you a question. We've been focusing on like the impact of a competency-based education from the student perspective. And like in this talk right here, we have majority of PhD students. How is this competency education going to impact instructors? And what are you looking for as like a president of an institution that we're going to probably see more like in the future? How do we prepare ourselves to be marketable and get into these institutions and teach in these institutions?
We can spend some time unpacking the challenge of the poor doctoral student in America today, given the nature of the market and the changes that are happening and the broken business models for so much of higher education right now. We can sort of unbundle the roles, right? So the questions, and I said, the first question is, what can you do with what you know to sort of curate and create competencies, understand what are the right competencies, the ways which evolve, what are they tied to? I use philosophy often as an example of this because I think philosophy departments and humanities generally have not told their story very well. And an economy and a society that's obsessed with jobs and job preparation, and that's the number one thing that is asked of higher ed today. So we've seen, as you know, the steady decline of the humanities and liberal arts generally. And what I'll say about competency-based education is like, it only says to the philosophy department, what claims would you make for what your students can do when they graduate with a philosophy degree from the University of Kansas? What I would argue is that there's a reason why McKinsey recruits philosophy graduates from the University of Kansas and Harvard and Yale and other places. It's because they actually have competencies that those guys value a lot. The work of a faculty member in a competency-based program is very much that of a curator. And in some ways, you could argue that that's always been part of the role of a faculty member. But here's what it's probably not in this sort of delivery of the learning, but rather the design of the learning. Competency-based education, because it's always an assessment of performance, really then becomes about how do you design the practice that leads to high levels of performance. So basically, in all of the places where our life depends on it, we actually don't trust traditional education. If you think about pilots or nurses or doctors, we say, look, it's great that you had a 4.0 from Embry-Riddle. Great, you did great in your flight program, but we're still going to have you spend a lot of time in the simulator. You're still going to do additional FAA exams. And more importantly, you're going to log a lot of hours in the right-hand seat before we let you slide over to the left-hand seat. We're basically going to watch you perform again and again and again until we're convinced you perform well. We do this. Clinicals for nurses and doctors are essentially the same thing. Great that you went to Kansas and you got a 4.0 as an undergrad. We're going to put you through a lot of practice, and we're not springing you free till we've assessed your ability to do something with all of that knowledge you gained along the way. Assessment will be automated. It already is being automated in lots of ways. In the places you see that, for example, are in simulations. Look at games, for example, as a way of a kind of analog for what we can do. So don't know if that gives you any more faith in the future, Ryan, but I think those are the ways I'd start to think about it at least.
My name is Ajibonolu Akurede. I'm from Nigeria. I'm based here currently in Nigeria. Basically, I work on media and information literacy. I co-founded a network, for students just about media and information literacy and, prepare themselves for the future. Basically, so my question is not like theoretical, but really related to, activism, getting the government to really do what is needed concerning the future of education, concerning digital future. Basically, in Nigeria now, there is no online, like any online program, degree, master's or anything that is approved by the government. So my question basically is based on your experience, running the university, getting your university to really work on digital learning and all that. What do you think? What were the challenges you faced, basically? And what challenges do you expect you are still going to face, with the new technologies that are coming up in trying to incorporate them into our education system? And basically, how did you deal with the problems you faced before? And how do you think we should, deal with the problems or challenges you are going to face in the future with the government and all? Thank you.
So in terms of the growth of our online program, we really have never faced much of a regulatory challenge in that, if you remember, when online learning really took off in the United States, non-for-profits looked down their nose at it. They saw it as poor quality. Faculty didn't want anything to do with it. Nature abhors a vacuum. So that's when the for-profits rushed in. And that's when you got the growth of Phoenix and some of these other schools that I mentioned earlier. At their height, they educated about 12% of all American college students. Then eventually, non-for-profits kind of came around, and you had early players in that space. And there were some actually pretty traditional, pretty high on the food chain schools, like Drexel was a big early leader, Northeastern University was an early leader. BU had a pretty substantial, not compared to us today, but at the time, reasonably substantial program. So you had a little bit of that, but it really wasn't till more, probably in the last 10 to 12 years, that not-for-profits moved much more emphatically into that space. And now, of course, with the pandemic, tons of schools are in the online world. There isn't probably a university in the country that isn't running some online program, some of them more aggressively and some of them not so much. So we didn't have the regulatory challenges once, actually it was the for-profits who kind of broke through that space, right? Who kind of opened it up. However, to your point, when we try to bring our programs into other countries, we do face a lot of very traditionally minded regulators who still believe that a face-to-face in the classroom with a traditionally prepared faculty member is sort of the sort of paradigm of quality. And I don't know how that changes, but I do think it's going to likely happen is that when we see, I think AI is going to drive down dramatically the cost of delivery for high quality education. And that is a huge boon to developing economies that can't afford the models that we generally speaking build today. If you take a look at what someone can afford in Mexico, for example, where we do a lot of work, you need to be below $1,500 a year to make it work. Very hard to do with traditional models that we've built for today. So the one thing that might happen actually in this next generation of models is you'll leapfrog online. You'll leapfrog the model that we use today. So those countries that went right to cell phone technology and skipped over telephone poles and miles of cable. So, but every country is its own regulatory nightmare. And look at, we're not clear in the U.S. still on how this is going to play out. I was on a call with the White House yesterday in which they're talking about pulling together a convening of people to at least just lay out what are the critical questions that have to be accounted for as U.S. education moves into a more AI-shaped paradigm. For example, we haven't talked about algorithmic bias, and a number of you have talked about ethics. Like, what are the ethical questions that policymakers need to think about? And it just, the reality is that good policy always follows practice. It won't anticipate it, but we should give policymakers the right questions to ask. Go to Ramon's sort of framework again. What are the right questions the policymakers should be asking, our regulators should be asking as they watch this emergence?
Thank you, Paul. I'm David Albert, so sometimes Bert Westbrook. I'm a professor of a lot of things, but my professorship's in law at SUNY. In finance, and I do sort of globalization theory stuff. There's a huge amount to say here, but I'm trying to figure out some way to say it that's useful in the present. This kind of talk has become kind of a genre already. And it echoes talks about technology and what it means that go back at least to the beginning of the camera. I'm interested in. So there are tropes and cliches everywhere. And one thing one might, I think, usefully do is spend some time thinking about the apparatus with which we think about this sort of thing. And so I'm going to pick one, but I'm going to suggest another one first. And the one I would suggest is not that long ago, and something, there was something called the widespread suspicion of meta-narratives that Lyotard famously used to define postmodernism, right? The sort of notion that Olympian positions were not available to the human, and that therefore what was hoped for was a kind of plurality, right? But now we have a device whose stated purpose is to eliminate plurality by weighing probabilities. That seems to me to be a fairly strong epistemic shift in a long generation. I think one could fairly easily tie that into, I teach finance, tie that into monopolistic capitalism, which is, of course, giving us AI. Divergence that looks like convergence is very much Microsoft's model. It's a little interesting to watch the way in which this has been sort of taken on board in this talk and otherwise as the inevitable course of history. Truckers will be. So I'm not going to take all of these things apart slowly or anything, but I am going to ask one more pointed question. And that is, I really quite liked speaking about relations, and I kind of like the moved ontology thing. But it seemed to me that one of the relations that is most fraught and has been, you mentioned Socrates, it has been for a long time, is the teacher-student relation, right? And so I think there's an awful lot of, this is my objection yesterday, John, to the Saudi idea, right? I'm also a fellow in the center, anyway, among other hats. But it seems to me that one of the things that we are saying, and we have good financial reasons to say this, right? We also have good administrative reasons to say this, good bureaucratic reasons to say this. So ChatGPT is going to make everything available and cheaper. I'm not sure that most education isn't about establishing status, and I'm not sure that has much to do with being cheap. And I'm certainly not sure that even in somewhat more modious circumstances, truth and beauty and all of that, maybe it matters who teaches you. And so it strikes me that in a weird way, one may be arguing, or you may be arguing, I don't know if you mean to be arguing, that if we flood the economy with an emphasis on relations, right, and relational employees, are we sort of talking about the democratization of the tutor? And I'll stop there.
So I was tracking you till you said the democratization of the tutor. So when I talked about flooding our society with relational jobs, I use teachers as examples, but also we talk about healthcare workers and mental health counselors and just to clarify, I'm focusing on education, right? Right. And if you say people who see themselves coming out of poverty, that somebody made a difference, right? And so as teachers, when they say, look, in constructing your worldview, somebody made a difference. Yep. Right. That may be a relational thing. And I think of that as tutoring or coaching. I often use coaching as a metaphor for teaching, right? Yeah, I agree. Anyway, but that's all that was meant by that. And so, yes, I am arguing that we would, I don't know if it's a democratizing, I'm not sure why we'd call it that, but we need to hire a whole lot more teachers if we're going to fix a broken K-12 system. We're going to need to do it in a way that allows them to focus on the relationships with their learners in a way that the system makes very difficult to do today. And it makes it difficult to do because we put too many people into a classroom. We ask teachers every day. So I gave this a version of this talk. I really would like to spend a day with you, David, because now I'm thinking, oh my God, am I falling into the tropes that you're alluding to? I want to unpack everything you said.
But it's okay.
No, it's super provocative. But I gave this talk in England recently in London, and I was interviewed by a journalist who said, look, I cover K-12. And in your book, this book that I alluded to that came out last fall, I talk about sort of, will we get to a place where teachers can love their students again? And by love, I mean putting in the time, knowing who they are, knowing them in their complexity, really being invested in them in the way that all great teachers have shaped us, I would argue. And that journalist said, if I said that to a teacher in London today, they would say, are you kidding me? So my week is filing, they use different terminology, but we would say lesson plans and serving on this committee. And they don't use lunch duty. They use a different phrase. And I do lunch duty, blah, blah, blah. And then I got this one troublesome kid and I'm understaffed. So I got to sort of take care of that. And I'm lucky if I even remember the names of my students. And you're asking me to love them? And what I would say is so much, no, you can't. Not the way the system is built and what it rewards and what it punishes. But so much of what you describe has to do with satisfying the system, not actually improving the life of the child in your room. I'm sure you know David Graeber's work, and the last book he did before he died was Bullshit Jobs, and he talks about not only the 65% or so people globally who think their job will go away tomorrow, no one would notice, but the percentage of your job that is not about the thing that matters most. And, we use a coaching model. So SNHU's model is not actually built on the centrality of the academic program. I know it sounds weird for a university president to say, but it's going to be well done. It's going to be reliable and have integrity. But the place we put our efforts and our sort of secret sauce, I would say, is our academic advisors, and we call them academic advisors. They're life coaches. They span, if you think about who we serve, they spend 20% of their time on academic questions and 80% on, no, David, I know it's been 10 years since you were in school and blah, blah. I know you think you can't do the work, but look you just did 2 semesters. You were great. I know your boss is crazy and your kids are, acting out. Like, it's amazing what they have to do. Got together with them recently, a group of advisors, and I said, hey, I want you to walk me through your day and your week. And so what percentage of your time are you in direct relationship with students, are doing a thing that touches an individual student versus things that satisfy SNHU's bureaucracy? It wasn't a great answer. And this is a place that really invests in it. So the approach we're taking with AI right now for the existing institution is, how do we automate the hell out of everything that isn't about human relationships and make more time so we can lower our caseloads, give our people more time to be in relationship with our learners, because that's the difference maker for us. And I think that's a difference maker in a K-12 school, right? So when I say, let's reduce, class sizes to 1 to 10. That's not democratizing, it's staffing up appropriately. So am I answering your question?
No, it's okay though. We're getting towards better questions. I think the question of education is deeply complicated by the questions of material employment and by extension social status. And it's very difficult to know what we're talking about at any given what blend of those we're talking about at any given moment.
So could you say a little bit more about the social status piece? Because I want to make sure I'm tracking you. I think I am, but I think that's a really important component. It's part of the conversation we don't have enough of, or sometimes we have too much of when we talk about American higher ed.
The varsity blues problem, right? Right. You've got a middle class that is desperate to preserve its position in the middle class, which this profoundly threatens, right? You've got a society of whatever it is, 340 million plus, and that's just this side of the Atlantic or the Pacific, right? And so who one is in that matters, right? So think of the use of names and titles and institutions, and that justifies things like payrolls and stuff like that. And universities do an awful lot to credential people for that sort of thing. And so there's this whole sort of relational network that is nominally built around the meritocracy. I do not think that a monopoly like AI is going to go far to upend that, but I'm not sure how it's going to transform that. I don't suddenly think that lie down the lamb.
When I heard you say status, I want to unpack that into all of the various ways that status plays out when we talk about American education. So when you talk about varsity blues, we're talking about the status of highly selective elite institutions, which represent a rounding error in terms of the number of students that get educated in the U.S. I can go all the way down the other end of the scale, and I watch people, we just had commencement this past weekend, so thousands of graduates who flew in from everywhere, students who did not necessarily expect to get a college degree. They went to SNHU, not Harvard. From one vantage point, you would say definitely not status. From their vantage point, the neighborhoods they grew up in, the places and families they come from.
So one of the things that your institution does is it makes a degree of status available by credentialing, which is fine. It's not the same credentialing one perhaps gets at Yale, or so not occupying the same position in the current dispensation, but it is a key function, and for that matter, is a key relational function, right? So your earlier discussion was knowledge. I like to tell my students facts are cheap, right? We all got phones. Right. So what can you do with the facts? Right. What can you do with the facts on the way to getting your law degree in my case? Right. And which is a status thing, not not necessarily a knowledge thing. And then there's the other relational part. What can you do with the facts that will impress me if you care about that? And if you don't, I certainly understand, but you probably won't stay in the class. I think a lot more is going on than access. Right. In other words, I'm actually trying to extend your earlier point about moving away from epistemics. Right. Yeah. But so then what does that then create for us socially? Particularly if we put this epistemic, to use a freighted word, meritocracy, or this educational industry as a key lever in how we construct social order.
I think that a lot of jobs that we associate with status, things one can do with knowledge and facts, are going to be displaced. I think for the percentage who stay behind, who still are working in those fields, I think the bar has been raised. I had a conversation with a British institution today who wanted to talk about their interdisciplinary programs. And their argument was, and I don't know how to evaluate their case here, but their argument is like, hey, interdisciplinary programs are often the poor stepchildren within an institution. They actually may be the most valuable thing we can do now, because it's interdisciplinarity that we start to think about system design, so that the limitations of AI becomes a powerful tool, but it isn't that. So maybe that's important. Don't know yet. And then I do worry about the huge social upheaval that I think is coming with loss of jobs. And I don't know how that intersects with your question, but we're going to be facing even more basic questions than status, which is, what do we do when more than half your country doesn't have meaningful work? And I go back to those relational jobs as ones not easily displaced by AI, but also not ones that don't have much status, right?
Good. Let me jump in here. I think this is a really deep and important line of questioning, but I'm going to kill it and move to Maz. Maz, introduce yourself, and floor is yours.
Hi, I'm Maz. I'm a PhD student here at the University of Kansas. You guys can hear me, right? Yeah, and my focus is on memory and cognitive science. So my question is around two ideas. One is accessibility of education, and one is motivation of students. So as technology continues to play a pivotal role in making education more accessible to the wider range of students, I think it begs the question, does increased access to educational resources translate into increased student motivation?
I think not at all. I think we have been preoccupied with the wrong things quite often in higher ed. We will spend forever talking about the design of a program, and I don't think that's the thing that makes a difference for the learners I'm most interested in. I'll sort of turn to Matt Beal here, who's the chair of the Marriott chair of something, but he's head of child and adolescent psychology at Georgetown. And Matt, when I interviewed Matt for my book, I asked him about this question, like, how do we think about deeply underserved communities and learners where we're trying to bring access? Like, how do we engage and what's critical to their success? And he didn't talk about the design of the program, which sort of evoked Donna Beadle again. What he says is sort of three things. Ideally, some spark that you can sort of hook onto, right? Like, it can be almost any interest at all. For an inner city kid, it could be physics, but it could be astronauts, it could be basketball, it could be fashion design, it could be music, but something in which they have a genuine interest. And I'll talk about a school that I think that does this brilliantly. Second thing he said is they ideally have 1 year of normal. And what he's talking about is a sense that there's a world that's better than the one I'm in. So they experience a time that you can evoke, or they've observed it close enough. So one of the stories of a student I tell in the book is a student who came out of the poorest neighborhood in Boston and the poorest of circumstances. You could almost write the script without me filling it in. But there's a program in the Boston area called MEDCO, which buses inner city students out to basically white, wealthy suburbs and puts them in those high schools. And they go back and forth. And he saw a world that looked better than the world he was in, and he didn't normalize for the place. I'm not a psychologist, I don't know the right term for this, but he really understood that there was a better world out there and there was another option. Matt would say those are really important, but the single most important thing, one person who believes in you. Like one person, right, goes back to that question again, who believes in you and says you are better than this. So I really despise the book Hillbilly Elegy by our Senator Vance of Ohio. But if you remember one part that did resonate, by the way, this is in some ways my background. So part of this is my own lens on the world. Immigrant parents who had my mother worked in a factory till she was in her 70s. If you remember the grandmother in that book, if you read it, she's this crazy, gun-toting, hard-drinking, swearing, he would say hillbilly. But she's a constant in his story in terms of believing he was better than the world in which they were in. And I think Matt sort of captures that really well. So when you talk about motivation of students, I think it comes out of relationship. I think it comes out of not wanting to disappoint that person who's put time into you and believes in you and thinks you're better than this. I don't think it's in the design of it. Like, good program design is important. You know, integrity and rigor are important, but I don't think that's the thing that drives learners, at least the learners I'm most interested in.
Hi. Sorry, my video was off. I didn't notice. So Denisa Karam from Bar-Ilan University in Israel, and I'm just very surprised that you have such a strong belief in these future relational jobs, how you call them, or in like focusing humanity's attention to some form of a care. And I wonder, is this like, because it sounds a bit like a phrase, or is it based on something you see as a trend? Because what I see is actually that our emotions, our well-being, our mental health, our happiness index, everything is in some sense already, taken care of in terms of quantified. And I just shared an article in the group. There is like in Denmark, in the school, they're using some app that monitors students' mood in order, to synchronize them on the optimal mood level. In the US, you have something called Goggle that is massively used in the primary education, and it monitors what the children write and, puts like these suicide alerts and I don't know other things if they use profanities, according to the articles that I read. I know companies that are doing this like a mood detection with university students. So I'm just like maybe not so optimistic about this luxury communism idea that the AIs will do all the job and we will just be nice to each other. I find it a bit, actually, that you're not asking the difficult question, what is the function of a university? And I don't think it's about building competencies that will help Microsoft get even bigger monopoly. I hope you're also educating people that are able to ask the difficult question of who owns these companies, these platforms, why they're not open source, why we don't have infrastructure for training models so someone in Nigeria can access it, where they cannot access even ChatGPT and all these things. So for me, it does sound a bit, and I'm joining actually David, a bit like, you're just helping them to get even more power over our lives rather than, creating some form of competencies that will create meaningful future for people. Sorry. It's nothing against you. I'm just, I'm really curious.
I will call upon my friend Tikna. You don't know me, so I don't take personally anything that you just said. And we haven't talked about, and my arguments about competencies, by the way, has never been to say what competencies. In fact, I think that's a common mistake, that people think that CB programs somehow dictate to an institution what competencies they should teach. So the competencies a program might elect to teach are the ones that allow you to deconstruct these systematic sorts of problems that you've identified with monopolistic capitalism, for example. Like that can be the competency that you teach. Their competencies are simply forcing institutions, universities, educators to make clear the claims they make for what students can do with what they know. The thing you may want students to be able to do with what they know is to take apart Microsoft, is to take apart capitalism, to take apart these structures that are so problematic. So I wouldn't tie your critique. I would untether this question, your critique, from the question of competencies or not. So the question of helping Microsoft, I'm not sure I'm tracking you. And part of the question I said I could love to sort of ask David some more questions. In some ways, I'm asking you the same question. Do you hear the attempt to understand and ask better questions of AI in an educational setting as helping Microsoft? Because the questions we might ask, just as we might ask questions of algorithmic bias, for example, or ethical questions around data and privacy, other questions we might ask, when I say I want better questions, is what are the things we have to be careful of if we are going to deploy AI, unless you're arguing we shouldn't deploy it at all? What are the questions we need to ask ourselves if we're going to deploy AI in education so that we don't actually contribute to inequity, so we don't contribute to monopolistic power that defines us in ways we don't? So I don't know that we're in disagreement. I just think I probably haven't expressed myself very well, if that's how you read it. I think one of the things, David, I don't know, Denise, that this is part of what I think I was inferring, but are you arguing, were you hearing in me a kind of inevitable surrender to the use of AI as we're currently experiencing it?
No, I'm just,
Okay.
you claimed that there will be these relational jobs that will come.
No, I don't.
It's like what Marx actually is claiming. If we solve the base, we will do the superstructures. I don't know, based on what do you believe there will be more relational jobs?
So if you listen carefully, I never said there would be. I'm making an argument that that's where we need to shift our thinking, because a lot of the sort of jobs that we assign status and compensation to today will go away. And what I said is that there's an enormous need for those jobs, called the relational. I would say in systems of care, there's enormous need. Whether our society will figure out how to fill that need, I think a lot of people would love those jobs if those jobs paid better. I don't know that I don't have the answer to that. Jamie Marasotis, who is the head of the Lumina Foundation, and I had worked on this idea of a human work initiative that argues we need a massive redistribution of wealth in the country to start paying people on the jobs that really matter. And the jobs that really matter, like early childhood educators, way more important than most college faculty in terms of actually shaping lives. But lowest on the status, we don't pay those jobs very well. Do I think we'll do that? I don't know. I think there are ways, that's the complicated question. But I think we better figure it out. And I do think those systems are deeply broken in our country.
Okay, good. We are thanks, Denisa. We are 9 minutes left. I want to finally jump back to Syed, the very patient Syed, the always patient.
Syed, you had your follow-up question an hour ago. I'm sorry.
All yours.
It's not. Well, I guess it's a follow-up question, but it's also kind of bringing it down to more practical matters. I was wondering, one of the things professions you mentioned was like accountants getting, do we need to train more accountants? So I used to be an accountant, and I did a little bit of auditing, nothing too deep or nothing too wide, but I was involved in a couple of audits. And I'm wondering, like, if we don't train people to know basic accounting, would we not lose auditors, or would we just trust AI to do the auditing also? And why I'm asking this is related to the writing and reading. I don't know the psychology of this. I know that we hear all the time is like, if you want to become a better writer, read more. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering, similarly, if we forego writing as one of the assessments, would we have worse readers? Would we have people who are less likely to know what is good writing versus bad writing, or quality of, literature, but also in the accounting sense? And I guess it can go into any of the professions. Like if we don't train people on these basic accounting, like, debits and credits, like, can you really do high level auditing that is required for humans to do? Or do we just give that up to AI? Let's just AI do the auditing too.
We'll say, what would you do with that comment from the guy at Oracle who said, we don't really write code anymore?
So my brother is a software developer for Chase, and he does exactly what you said. They get they just grab stuff from GitHub.
Right? They're architects, that they're curators, link code from GitHub, et cetera. So somewhere along the way in their training, they had to know enough to be able to do that task. And my question to him was, but did you have to write lines of code in order to have those frameworks of understanding? And his argument was no. It raises the bar. You have to have, I'm going to use my analogy. I never wrote a line of fiction, but I think I got pretty good somewhere along the line. So I looked at a lot of fiction. I obviously read a lot of fiction. Do I have to look at a lot of code? And can you train me for the things for which I need to look? I think those are the ways I might come at that. I think writing for me is one I still really wrestle with, and I don't have a good sense of. I like A.O. Wilson's comment about, storytelling. So I think of writing storytelling often because I write a lot. Storytelling is not the thing we do after we've thought about something and now we want to share with the world. Storytelling is actually the way we think. We think in stories. And I don't know what the implications are for writing and reading. I know writing and reading have evolved. Certainly writing has evolved dramatically over the eons, right? From oral storytelling to writing to printing press to email and hyperliteracy and other kinds of things. So I think we will go through some other similar kind of shift here, and still trying to understand what that might look like.
Thank you. David, go ahead.
Yeah, David, jump in. David?
Me, David?
And John, I have to apologize. I have to preside over a ceremony in 5 minutes. So
okay.
I have 5 minutes. But I have to
Sorry. Bert. David, you didn't have your hand up, did you? David?
No, I didn't, but I do have a question.
Okay.
I will go after Bert. I can go after Bert, though.
We may not have time for two, so.
Okay. No, I defer to David.
Okay. So this is a kind of a question on the sort of last line of answering a question between you and Syed is, I guess one fear I have with the testimonials of the coder is, one, they're already coming from a background of knowing how to code and things like that. So I fear that it may be hard to assess what we'll lose if we haven't quite lost it yet. That's my concern, and I'm not sure if you'll be able to speak to it. Maybe we aren't able to speak to it.
I think these are exactly the kinds of questions we're just trying to surface and understand at this point.
Yeah, very good. So one of the things that, by way of closing, that we've thought a lot about here at KU is how to restructure the computer science curriculum around these kinds of foundational skills, so that you would understand the foundations of computer science, in addition to having some exposure to coding, but that coding is really a secondary kind of a skill you'd pick up along the way. And that in many ways, it's more important for you to learn first order logic, or maybe some basic meta logic, to learn the lambda calculus instead of learning Python. And I think that's probably the way we're going to go. Similarly, I mean, I could go on and on, but we only have 3 minutes left. So,
it's fascinating.
Yeah. So maybe what we should do is, Paul, if you'd be receptive to email questions from the crew, I can share your email with folks, and we'll continue the discussion in text form. So at this point, I'd really like to thank you, Paul, for your time, and thank all the attendees for great questions and excellent discussion. So thanks so much.
Thanks so much for having me. You made you challenged my thinking in lots of great ways, which is exactly what you hope from conversations like this. I really appreciate it.
Very good. Glad to hear.
Take care.
Thank you, Paul.
Bye-bye.
See you guys next time. Bye-bye.